In eastern Ecuador, in a valley the Upano River runs through, a survey aircraft firing laser pulses through the canopy recorded what lies beneath it. Thousands of raised earthen platforms set out in blocks, roads cut down into the ground, running straight for kilometres, some wide enough for a lane of traffic. Above them, the forest looks untouched. Archaeologists believe people were living here 2,500 years ago. For 4 centuries, we were told this jungle was empty. Who built the cities under the trees? The valley lies on the eastern edge of the Andes, in the Ecuadorian province of Morona Santiago, at the place where the mountains stop climbing and start to come apart into the lowlands. The Upano River runs through it, grey with sediment, cutting between terraces of old volcanic soil. To the west stands Sangay, one of the most persistently active volcanoes in South America, which has been erupting on and off for as long as anyone has kept records of it, and which drops fine ash across the valley floor in layers that harden and pack down over the centuries. The forest here is dense, wet, and tall, and from the ground you can walk for an hour and see very little except the trunks immediately around you. Archaeologists came here before. In the 1970s, an Ecuadorian archaeologist named Pedro Porras excavated near Sangay and found earthen mounds and quantities of pottery, enough to know that people had lived here in some organized way. French and Ecuadorian teams returned across the following decades and dug more. They knew the valley held a site. What no one could establish from the ground was how far it went, because the canopy allows you to see one platform at a time, and one platform at a time is not a shape you can read. In 2015, Ecuador's National Heritage Institute commissioned an aerial survey of roughly 300 square kilometres of the valley, using an instrument mounted beneath a small aircraft. The instrument fires laser pulses downward, hundreds of thousands of them every second, in a sweeping line as the plane moves forward. Most of those pulses strike a leaf or a branch and bounce straight back. A small fraction find a gap, slip through the canopy, and reach the ground before returning. The instrument measures how long each pulse took to come home, converts that into a distance, and records a point in space. Fly the same ground repeatedly, and you accumulate tens of millions of points, a cloud of them, most of them describing the tops of trees. Software then strips out everything that sits above the lowest returns in each patch, and what remains is a model of the bare earth beneath the forest, accurate enough to register a change in height of a few tens of centimetres. The technique was borrowed from forestry and flood mapping. Applied to archaeology, it does something no excavation can do, which is to show the whole shape at once. When the Upano data was processed and the trees were taken away, the valley floor underneath was covered in rectangles. The survey recorded more than 6,000 earthen platforms inside that 300 square kilometre window. They are not natural landforms. Most of them measure somewhere around 20 metres by 10 and stand roughly 2 metres above the surrounding ground, with straight edges and squared corners. They sit in groups, commonly 3 to 6 platforms arranged around a shared open space, and those groups sit alongside other groups in a pattern that repeats across the terraces for kilometre after kilometre. Some platforms are considerably larger than the standard size, raised higher, positioned at the centre of their cluster, which archaeologists generally read as a sign that they carried something more than an ordinary household. 5 major concentrations were identified within the surveyed area, given the names Sangay, Quilometre, Copuazeno, Nigiamanga, and Cunguince. Sangay and Quilometre are the largest, and each contains hundreds of platforms with open plazas set among them. some of those plazas cut down into the ground rather than built up. The findings were published in the journal Science at the beginning of 2024 by a team led by the French archaeologist Stephen Rostaing, who had already spent decades working in Amazonian Ecuador, along with Antoine Dorison and colleagues from Ecuadorian and French institutions. Rostaing has said in interviews since that he had been walking over parts of this for years without grasping the extent of it. That admission matters because it explains why something of this size stayed unrecognized so long. A platform seen from the forest floor is a low rise covered in roots and leaf litter. It reads as ground. Only the aggregate reads as design. Radiocarbon dates and ceramic sequences from the excavated portions suggest people began building in the valley somewhere around 500 years before the Common Era, and that the platform complexes remained in use for something on the order of 1,000 years afterward, with the main occupation winding down between roughly 300 and 600 of the Common Era. Archaeologists divide that span into phases with their own names and their own pottery styles, which tells us the valley was not built in a single burst by a single generation. It was maintained, altered, and rebuilt over a length of time comparable to the whole life of the Roman Republic and Empire together. Somebody was passing on the plan. Estimating how many people lived here is harder, and the researchers involved have been careful about it. One published estimate proposes a minimum in the region of 10,000 inhabitants, with a possible peak several times higher. Though those upper figures rest on assumptions about how many people occupied each platform and how many platforms stood at the same moment, and no one has been able to prove a firm number. Not every structure was necessarily in use simultaneously. What the earthworks do establish, regardless of the exact population, is a quantity of labour. Each platform is a deliberate mass of soil dug from somewhere and carried to somewhere else, and shaped, without draft animals, without wheeled transport, without metal tools of the kind used in the Old World. Multiply that by 6,000 and add the plazas, the terraces, and the cut banks, and you are looking at an investment of work that cannot be produced by a small group moving through the forest and living lightly on it. It requires people who stayed, who could feed themselves reliably enough to spare hands for construction, and who agreed on where things should go. That last point is the one that unsettles the older picture most. The platforms are not scattered where convenient. They face consistent directions. They cluster around shared open ground. The whole arrangement follows the natural terraces of the river, using the flat land and leaving the steep slopes, which suggests the builders were reading the valley as a single surface to be organized, rather than a series of separate spots to be occupied. This is where the difficulty begins, because for most of the 20th century the accepted view of Amazonia held that the region could not support anything like this. The soils were understood to be thin and quickly exhausted, the rainfall too heavy, the environment too limiting, and the human societies it produced, therefore small, mobile, and necessarily simple. That view was argued in detail by serious researchers on the basis of evidence they found convincing, and we will come back to how it was built, because it has its own history and its own logic. For now, what matters is the collision. The Upano data does not fit inside it, and the immediate objection to the Upano data, which is a fair one, is that this valley is not typical Amazonia. It sits in the Andean foothills, on the transition between mountain and lowland, at an altitude where conditions are gentler than the deep basin. It has the volcano nearby, and volcanic ash weathers into soil considerably more fertile than the leached red earth of the central Amazon. Some archaeologists have argued that Upano is a special case, a pocket of favourable ground on the edge of the forest, rather than evidence about the forest itself. That argument deserves to be taken seriously, and it can only be tested by looking at what lies further east, out in the basin proper, far from any volcano. Sangay also complicates the story in another direction. The same ash that enriched the soil buried the settlements, sealing the platforms under volcanic deposits, which is part of why they survived at all in a climate that dissolves most things people leave behind. Preservation here was an accident of geology. The evidence suggests eruptions may also have contributed to the eventual abandonment of the valley, though the record is not clear enough to say that with confidence, and other explanations have been proposed. There is one more feature in the laser data, and it is the feature that pushed this from a large settlement to something else. Running between and through the platform clusters, the survey picked up roads, not paths worn by feet, but constructed roads, dug down below the level of the surrounding ground, with earth banks thrown up on either side, some of them measuring around 10 meters across. They run straight. They cross the terrain rather than following it, holding their line over ground where a walking route would sensibly curve, and one of them continues for something in the order of 25 kilometres. A road that ignores the landscape is a road built by people who decided in advance where it was going to go. And that decision, more than the platforms themselves, is what tells us what kind of place this was. A road is a strange thing to find in a rainforest, because a rainforest does not require one. Movement through the Amazon has always been possible along rivers, and where rivers do not go, a walking trail through the understory can be cut in a day, and will close again within a few seasons of neglect. A trail costs almost nothing. It bends around the awkward ground, drops into the ravine and climbs the far side, and it exists only as long as feet keep using it. What the laser survey found running between the platform complexes of the Upano Valley was something of a different order. The roads there were excavated. The builders dug the running surface down below the level of the surrounding land, sometimes by a meter or more, and piled the removed earth along both sides to form banks, so that a person walking the route would have been moving in a shallow trench with raised edges at shoulder height in places. The widest of them measure around 10 meters across. That is a corridor as broad as a modern two-lane street, in a society with no wheeled vehicles and no animal capable of pulling one, where every load moved on a human back. The largest are not the only ones. The survey recorded a whole hierarchy of routes, from these major dug thoroughfares down through narrower connecting roads to small paths linking neighbouring platform groups, which is the signature of a network rather than a single grand construction. And the major ones run straight. This is the detail that changes the reading of the valley. A footpath curves because curving is cheaper, and the accumulated small decisions of people walking always produce a line that follows the easiest ground. The Upano roads hold their heading across terrain that offers no encouragement. They cut through rises instead of going around them. They cross ravines and streams, which means the builders had to bridge or fill those crossings and then maintain them. In several places, the survey shows roads meeting one another at close to right angles, and one of the routes has been traced for something in the order of 25 kilometres before the surveyed area runs out. It does not stop there because the road stopped. It stops there because the aircraft did. Straightness on that scale is expensive, and the expense is the information. Someone had to decide where the line was going before any earth was moved, and then persuade or organize a large number of people to spend a great deal of labor realizing a decision that had already been made. A curved trail is the record of many individual choices. A straight road is the record of a single choice imposed on the ground and imposed on the people who dug it. Archaeologists working in other parts of the Americas have drawn similar conclusions from similar evidence. The Maya-built raised limestone causeways, known as Sacbiob, running between centers in the Yucatan, one of which extends roughly 100 kilometers from Cobar to Yaxuna. In Chaco Canyon in New Mexico, ancestral Puebloan communities constructed wide, straight roads that hold their bearing across mesas and, at some points, use carved stairways to continue over cliff faces rather than deviate. Those societies are not related to the builders of Upano, and there is no suggestion of contact between them. The comparison is useful for a narrower reason. In each case, researchers have concluded that a road built to ignore the landscape is doing more than carrying traffic, because traffic can be carried far more cheaply by a route that respects the terrain. The straightness is doing something else. What that something else might be at Upano is not settled, and the researchers have been careful in how they put it. One proposal is that the roads were primarily about connection in a formal sense, tying the platform complexes into a single recognized whole, so that the arrangement of the valley was legible on the ground and not simply from above. Movement along a sunken road with banks on either side is a controlled experience. You cannot leave it easily. You see what the banks allow you to see, and you arrive where the road decides you arrive. Approaching a plaza that way is a different act from wandering into a clearing. Another proposal, which the excavators have raised for some of the larger earthworks, is defensive. Ditches and banks are the basic components of fortification everywhere in the world, and some of the Upano platform groups are enclosed by ditched features that do not obviously serve drainage. A sunken road with high sides is also a road that can be blocked and watched. Neither reading excludes the other, and the evidence as published does not allow a firm choice between them. There is a third element in the laser data that has to be set alongside the roads, and it may be the most important because it addresses the question of how the whole system fed itself. Between and around the platform clusters, the survey picked up rectangular fields bounded by low earthen edges and drainage features, laid out in blocks along the same alignments as the platforms and the roads. Agricultural land, in other words, planned into the same grid. The valley floor was not settlement surrounded by wilderness. It was settlement interleaved with worked ground, and the drainage suggests deliberate management of water in a place that receives a great deal of it. Maize and manioc are both attested in the region, and archaeologists believe a mixed system of cultivated staples and managed tree crops is the most likely basis for the population, though the direct botanical evidence from Upano itself is still limited and no one has been able to reconstruct the full diet with confidence. That water management points at something the roads make you think about once you have stopped being impressed by them. A trench dug into sloping ground in a place with heavy seasonal rainfall becomes, within a single wet season, a watercourse. Rain finds it, runs down it, and begins removing the surface. Any sunken road in that climate is under continuous attack from the weather that built the forest around it, which means these routes were not constructed once and then left. They had to be cleared, recut, and repaired year after year, generation after generation, for as long as they remained in use. Some researchers have suggested the incised design may itself have been part of a drainage strategy, moving water off the terraces in a controlled way rather than allowing it to sheet across the fields. Though this remains a proposal rather than a demonstrated function, either way the maintenance requirement stands, and it tells us something no single monument can. Building a road demands an organized effort. Keeping a road demands an organized society, one that survives the death of whoever ordered the work and keeps performing it because the arrangement continues to make sense to the people doing the digging. The Upano network was in use, on current dating, for something close to a millennium. The direction of the roads raises a further question that the valley cannot answer on its own. The Upano sits on the eastern flank of the Andes, in the transitional zone that archaeologists sometimes call the Montaña, the belt of steep forested country between the High Sierra and the lowland basin. This belt has long been understood as a corridor. Products of the lowlands moved up into the highlands, and products of the highlands moved down, and the pottery recovered from the Upano complexes shows stylistic relationships in both directions, which the evidence suggests reflects sustained contact rather than isolation. A network of engineered roads sitting precisely on that corridor invites the thought that some of this traffic was organized at a scale we have not previously credited. It is a reasonable thought, and it is not yet a demonstrated one. What can be said is that the valley was not a pocket sealed off from everything around it, and that whatever was happening here was happening in relation to neighbours. Set the roads beside the 6,000 platforms, and the shape of the problem becomes clear. Individually, each element admits a modest explanation. A large village can raise mounds. A community can clear a track. Taken together, with the fields laid into the same alignment and the whole thing sustained across 1,000 years, they describe a landscape that was engineered as a unit by people who thought at the scale of a valley rather than a settlement, and who had the means to make that thinking permanent in the ground. The word researchers have increasingly used for this pattern is urban, and the word is contested, because these places look nothing like the dense walled cities of Mesopotamia or the Indus. The argument over what to call them is not a quarrel about vocabulary. It goes to the heart of what we assume a city has to be, and whether the model we inherited from the old world was ever the only available design. Before any of that can be tested, there is a more immediate problem to face, and it is a problem of dates. The Upano complexes are old. Not old in the way the phrase is usually meant when applied to the Americas, but old enough to sit alongside civilizations on other continents that we teach as foundational, and that placement is where the discomfort in this discovery really lies. Dates are the part of archaeology that people tend to accept without asking how they were arrived at. And in this case, the how is worth following because the whole weight of the Upano discovery rests on it. If the valley were 1,000 years old, it would be interesting. At 2,500 years, it becomes a problem for the way the human past has been arranged. So it is fair to ask how anyone knows. 3 lines of evidence support the chronology, and they were assembled over decades rather than produced by the laser survey, which is a point often lost in the coverage of the 2024 publication. The laser found the shapes. The dates came from the ground, from excavation, and most of that work was done long before anyone flew a scanner over the valley. The first line is radiocarbon. Every living thing takes in carbon while it is alive, and a small, roughly constant fraction of that carbon is the unstable isotope carbon 1,4. When the organism dies, intake stops, and the unstable fraction begins to decay at a known rate, halving approximately every 5,700 years. Measure how much remains in a fragment of charcoal from a hearth, or a seed, or a piece of burnt post, and you can calculate how long ago that material stopped living. The technique has limits that matter here. It dates the death of the organism, not the construction of the thing the organism ended up in, So charcoal from an old tree burnt as firewood can return a date centuries earlier than the fire that consumed it. It requires calibration against tree ring records and other archives, because the atmospheric level of carbon 1,4 has not been perfectly steady across time, and calibration in the southern hemisphere uses a different curve from the northern one. It produces a range rather than a point, always quoted with a probability attached. And it dates only what was sampled. A date from the base of one platform tells you about that platform. The second line is ceramics. The Upano Valley has yielded very large quantities of pottery, and pottery styles change. Vessel shapes, rim profiles, the composition of the clay, the temper mixed into it, the decoration incised or painted on the surface, all shift over time in ways that are locally consistent. Excavators build a sequence by recording which styles appear together in which layers, then tie that sequence to radiocarbon dates from the same layers. Once anchored, the sequence becomes a dating tool in its own right, so that a sherd found in a new trench can be placed in time without another laboratory measurement. The Upano ceramic phases carry names drawn from the region, among them Sangay and Upano, and the succession from one to the next is what allows archaeologists to say the valley was occupied continuously rather than in two separate episodes with a gap between. The weakness of the method is that it depends entirely on the anchoring dates being right and on styles having travelled the way the excavators assume. The third line is the volcano, and here Sangay does something useful. A large eruption deposits ash across the landscape in a single event, and that ash settles as a distinct layer, chemically identifiable, laid down everywhere at once. Anything found below it is older than the eruption, anything above it is younger. Where a platform was built on top of an ash layer and then buried by a later one, the construction is bracketed between two events, and if either event can be dated independently, the bracket tightens. Tephrochronology, as the method is called, provides a stratigraphic framework that does not depend on a single sample surviving contamination. Excavations in the Upano Valley have recorded multiple ash deposits interleaved with occupation layers, which is part of why the sequence there is better resolved than at many lowland sites, where the acidic soil destroys organic material and no volcano obliges by sealing anything. Put together, these lines indicate that construction in the valley began around 500 years before the Common Era, with some published estimates reaching back somewhat earlier, and that the platform complexes remained in use until roughly 300 to 600 of the Common Era. Archaeologists have been explicit that the earliest and latest dates carry the most uncertainty, that not all 5 complexes need have begun or ended simultaneously, and that the picture may shift as more of the valley is excavated. It is a chronology with edges that are still soft. The middle of it, however, is firm enough that no one working in the region disputes the broad span. Now place that span against the rest of the world, because the placement is what unsettles people. When the first platforms were being raised at Upano, the Greek city-states were approaching the century that produced Athenian democracy and the Parthenon. Rome was a small city on a river, some way from controlling Italy, let alone anything beyond it. In Mesoamerica, the Olmec centers were in decline, and Monte Alban had recently been founded in the Oaxaca Valley, while the great construction phases at Teotihuacan lay several centuries in the future. The Nazca lines had not been made. Machu Picchu would not be built for another 2,000 years, and the Inca state that built it did not exist in any form. By the time the Upano complexes were being abandoned, the Western Roman Empire was collapsing. That comparison is not offered to rank these places against one another. It is offered because the mental map most of us carry has a shape, and the shape puts the Amazon at the far end of it, receiving developments late or not at all. On the actual timeline, the valley sits early. The people building here were doing so while much of what we treat as the ancient world was still assembling itself. The discomfort this causes has a specific source, and it is worth naming precisely because it is not simply that the dates are old, it is that the dates are old and the site is in the wrong place. Archaeology inherited from the 19th century a rough hierarchy of environments in which certain landscapes were understood to be capable of producing complex societies and others were not. River valleys with annual floods and manageable irrigation belonged in the first category, which is why Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus, and the Yellow River became the standard list. Tropical rainforest belonged firmly in the second. It was thought too hot, too wet, too disease-ridden, its soils too poor once cleared, its resources too dispersed to concentrate. Where monumental remains did turn up in the tropics, as in the Maya lowlands or at Angkor, they were treated for a long time as anomalies requiring special explanation, and in the Maya case the assumption that the forest could not sustain dense populations shaped interpretation well into the 20th century until survey work established how many people had actually been living there. Amazonia never even reached the anomaly stage, because until very recently there seemed to be nothing there to explain. There is a second reason the Upano dates land awkwardly, and it concerns what the builders did not have. No metal tools have been recovered from these complexes beyond ornamental work. No evidence of the wheel, which was never adopted for transport anywhere in the pre-contact Americas. No draft animals, since the continent's large domesticable species had gone extinct thousands of years earlier, and no writing system that anyone has identified. The list matters because those items function in the popular imagination as prerequisites for civilization. What Upano suggests is that the list describes one route rather than the requirements. The platforms, the roads, and the field systems were produced by people with stone tools, wooden implements, fire, and an enormous amount of coordinated human labor, and the result is not a lesser version of an old world city. It is a different design, arrived at under different constraints, and it lasted about 1,000 years. Still, one objection remains standing, and it is the same one that closed the first stage of this investigation. Upano is not the deep Amazon. It sits at around 800 meters of altitude on the Andean flank, in a valley made fertile by volcanic ash, at the meeting point of two economic worlds. Everything described so far might be explained as a highland-adjacent phenomenon that happens to sit inside the forest boundary on a map. If the received view of Amazonia is going to be tested properly, the test cannot be conducted here. It has to be conducted out in the basin itself, on the leached and famously impoverished soils that the whole Argonaut was built on, hundreds of kilometers from any mountain, which returns the investigation to a question that has been waiting since the first platform appeared in the laser data, and that no amount of surveying can answer on its own. 6,000 raised structures require people. People require food every day, in quantity for 1,000 years, in a place where the standard account holds that the ground cannot support it. Anywhere a road has been cut through the forest on high ground in the central Amazon, the bank at the side of the cutting shows the same thing. Red earth, several meters of it, fine-grained and uniform, running down past the point where the tree roots stop. It looks like fertile ground. Gardeners in temperate countries would recognize the color and expect good things from it. It is, in fact, among the most exhausted soil on the planet, and understanding why is the only way to grasp what the builders of any large Amazonian settlement were up against. Most of the basin sits on a continental shield of enormous age, rock that has been standing in place without mountain building, without glaciers scraping it clean, without volcanoes resurfacing it, for a span measured in tens of millions of years. Across that time, it has been rained on. Much of the basin receives somewhere between 2 and 3,000 millimeters of rainfall a year, and water moving down through soil carries dissolved minerals with it, taking the soluble nutrients steadily downward and out. Calcium goes, magnesium goes, potassium goes. What remains, after enough millions of years of this, is a residue of the least soluble components, chiefly iron and aluminium oxides, and the iron is what supplies the red. Soil scientists classify most of these upland soils as oxisols and altisols, and the classification is essentially a description of what has been removed. They're acidic. They hold very little in the way of exchangeable nutrients, and the aluminium in them becomes soluble at low pH in concentrations that damage the roots of many crop plants. Phosphorus, which every plant requires, is present but tends to bind tightly to iron and aluminium compounds in a form roots cannot easily take up. A farmer accustomed to European or North American ground, handed a hectare of Amazonian terra firma, would plant into it and watch the second year's harvest come in at a fraction of the first. The forest standing on top of this appears to contradict it. 200 tons of living biomass per hectare, trees rising 50 meters, a canopy so productive that the basin is often described as one of the great engines of the planet's atmosphere, all of it growing out of ground that cannot feed a maize field for 4 consecutive seasons. The contradiction resolves once you understand where the nutrients in this system actually are. They are not in the soil. They are in the vegetation, held in living wood and leaf and root, and the forest keeps them there by refusing to let them touch the ground for long. A leaf falls. In a temperate woodland, it would lie through winter and decompose across a year or more, building a layer of humus. On the forest floor here, in constant heat and constant damp, the decomposition begins within days, and a dense mat of fine roots and fungal threads sits waiting directly beneath the litter to intercept whatever is released. Mycorrhizal fungi, growing in partnership with the tree roots, pull nutrients out of decaying material and pass them back into the living system before rain can wash them downward. The cycle is almost closed. Nutrients travel from tree to litter to fungus to tree again, around and around, held in circulation by the very organisms they sustain, and the red earth below is little more than the physical structure the whole arrangement stands on, which explains what happens when the forest is removed. Cut it and burn it, as farmers across the tropics have done for thousands of years, and the nutrients locked in that biomass are released all at once into a layer of ash. Ash is alkaline, which temporarily corrects the acidity, and it is rich in exactly the minerals the soil lacks. The first planting into a freshly burnt clearing does well. The second is usually acceptable. By the 3rd or 4th season, the rain has carried most of the ash-borne nutrients down beyond the reach of roots. Weeds have colonized the opening, and yields fall to the point where the effort stops being worth it. The plot is abandoned to regrow, and the farmer opens a new one. Swidden cultivation, practiced across Amazonia and throughout the tropical world, is not an inefficient method. It is an intelligent response to a real constraint, and where population densities are low and land is plentiful, it can be sustained indefinitely, provided each plot is given 10 or 20 years of fallow. to rebuild its biomass before being cut again. The constraint it imposes is on concentration, a system requiring that much fallow land per hectare under cultivation cannot support many people in one place, and it obliges those people to keep moving. Manioc, the staple crop of much of lowland South America, softens the problem without solving it. The plant tolerates acid soil and aluminium far better than maize does. It stores its energy in a tuber that can be left in the ground for many months rather than harvested on a fixed schedule, and it produces a substantial yield of calories from poor land. What it does not produce is protein. The tuber is overwhelmingly starch, and the bitter varieties carry cyanogenic compounds that must be grated, pressed, and heated out before the flour is safe to eat. A labor-intensive process that Amazonian peoples developed to a high degree of sophistication. An influential argument advanced in the 1970s took this seriously and proposed that animal protein, rather than calories, was the real ceiling on Amazonian populations. Since game in tropical forest is dispersed and thins out quickly around any settlement that stays put, and fish are abundant only along certain rivers, the rivers themselves divide along the same lines. The Amazon's whitewater tributaries, the Madeira, the Ucayali, the main stem itself, run down out of the Andes, carrying suspended sediment ground off young mountains, and where they flood each year they lay that sediment across their margins. The Várzea, the seasonally inundated floodplain, is genuinely fertile ground, renewed annually, and it also carries far more fish than the surrounding uplands. The Blackwater rivers are the opposite case. The Rio Negro drains ancient lowland forest rather than mountains. Its water stained the color of strong tea by dissolved plant compounds, so nutrient poor that early naturalists remarked on the scarcity of insects along it, and biologists have sometimes described such rivers as rivers of hunger. The fertile ground, in other words, exists, and it exists in narrow ribbons along particular watercourses, amounting to a small percentage of the basin. Everything away from those ribbons is terra firm, and terra firm is the red earth in the road cutting. There is one external correction to all this, and it arrives from 4,000 kilometres away. Dust lifted off the Baudelaire Depression in Chad, a dry lake bed of ancient diatom deposits, crosses the Atlantic on the trade winds and settles over South America, and one satellite-based estimate has proposed that the phosphorus contained in it amounts to something in the order of 22,000 tons a year, roughly balancing what the basin loses to its rivers. The Amazon is fertilized, thinly and continuously, by the Sahara. It is a striking fact, and it changes nothing about the immediate problem, because that quantity spread across 7 million square kilometres is a dusting, not a supply a farmer can plant into. Assemble all of this, and the received view of Amazonian prehistory stops looking like prejudice and starts looking like an inference. If the soils cannot hold nutrients, if clearing releases them only briefly, if the staple crop is deficient in protein, if game disperses, and the fertile land is confined to floodplain strips, then the societies this environment permits ought to be small, mobile, and organized at the scale of the village. That was the conclusion the 20th century reached, and it was reached by researchers examining real evidence rather than by anyone dismissing the region out of hand. The trouble is the ground itself keeps failing to cooperate with the argument. Along stretches of the middle and lower Amazon, and on the bluffs above the confluences, there are patches of soil that do not behave the way the surrounding earth behaves. They are black rather than red. They run to a metre deep in places and considerably more in others. They are studded with fragments of broken pottery. Farmers in the region have known about them for generations and seek them out deliberately because crops planted in them grow the way crops grow in Iowa, and they keep growing there season after season without the yields collapsing. The soil is locally called terra preta do Indio, the black earth of the Indians, and the name contains the answer that took science most of a century to take seriously. Those patches are not a geological accident. They are the residue of settlements, formed out of the debris of daily life over long periods of habitation, and they occur exactly where the standard account says nobody was supposed to be living in numbers. Whatever the people at Upano were doing on their volcanic terraces, someone out in the deep basin had confronted the same nutrient problem and arrived at a different answer, one that did not depend on a mountain range or a helpful volcano, and one that is still producing crops for smallholders 1,000 years after the people who made it were gone. The bluffs above the Amazon and its major tributaries carry a feature that anyone walking them can find without instruments. The ground changes colour. Across a boundary that is sometimes gradual and sometimes sharp enough to step over, the red and yellow oxisols give way to earth that is dark brown or nearly black, greasy in texture, and full of small, hard fragments that turn out on inspection to be broken pottery. The dark ground can run 1/2 metre deep, and at some locations it has been recorded at 2 metres or more. It occurs in patches, from areas smaller than a football field up to expanses covering many dozens of hectares, and it sits preferentially on the higher ground overlooking water, on terraces and bluff edges above confluences, which is precisely where a person would choose to live if they wanted access to fish and river traffic while staying above the annual flood. Smallholders across the region have known this soil for as long as anyone has recorded their practices, and they seek it out to plant in, because papaya, maize, melons and bananas grow in it the way they grow in the alluvial farmland of temperate countries, and they keep growing there year after year without the collapse in yield that governs cultivation everywhere else on terra firme. The Portuguese name for it in Brazil is terra preta de Indio, and the name is a piece of local knowledge that ran centuries ahead of the science because it identifies both what the soil is and who made it. European observers noticed the black earth early. Naturalists travelling the Amazon in the 19th century recorded the pottery in it and understood that people had once lived where it occurred. The connection remained an observation rather than a research program until a Dutch soil scientist named Wim Sombroek, who had worked in Brazil for the Food and Agriculture Organization, published a study of Amazonian soils in 1966 that treated the dark earths as a subject in their own right and argued that they were anthropogenic. Sombroek had a personal reason for taking dark soils seriously. He had grown up in the Netherlands on plagan soils, ground built up over generations by farmers hauling in turf and manure until the topsoil stood higher than the surrounding land, and he recognized the same principle at work. His argument was slow to spread and slower to be accepted, and for decades the dark earths were treated in the literature as a curiosity of soil science rather than as evidence about human history. What eventually forced the reassessment was chemistry. Terra preta is not merely darker soil. Analyses have found phosphorus concentrations many times higher than in adjacent ground, along with elevated calcium, magnesium, zinc, and manganese, a pH close to neutral rather than strongly acidic, and a capacity to hold on to exchangeable nutrients that the surrounding oxisols entirely lack. The phosphorus and calcium have an identifiable source in bone. These sites contain the residue of fish, turtle, mammal, and bird consumed over long periods. together with shell and bone, is where an animal stores those two elements. The near-neutral pH points to ash, which neutralizes acidity and suppresses the aluminium toxicity that limits root growth in ordinary Amazonian soil. The component that turned out to matter most, though, is charcoal. Terra preta is loaded with pyrogenic carbon, fragments of incompletely burnt organic material, and some published analyses have reported concentrations of black carbon many times higher than in surrounding soils. In one influential study by a large multiple, charcoal behaves in soil in a way that ordinary organic matter does not. Burning wood at relatively low temperatures with limited oxygen drives off the volatile components and leaves behind a structure of condensed aromatic carbon rings, which soil microorganisms find very difficult to break down. Where a fallen leaf in this climate is consumed within weeks, and a piece of buried wood within a few years, charcoal persists for centuries, and in these deposits has persisted for millennia. Its physical structure is porous at a microscopic scale, preserving the cell architecture of the wood it came from, which gives it an enormous internal surface area, and that surface, as it slowly oxidizes over decades, develops negatively charged sites that attract and hold positively charged nutrient ions. The technical measure is cation exchange capacity, and it is the property Amazonian upland soil most conspicuously lacks. Charcoal supplies it. The pores also provide habitat, sheltering bacteria and fungi from predation and desiccation, and studies of terra preta have found microbial communities distinct in composition from those in the adjacent forest soils, which suggests the biological character of the ground was altered along with its chemistry. What this amounts to is a soil that does not leak. The nutrient loss that governs cultivation on terra firma is a hydraulic problem, rain carrying dissolved minerals down beyond the root zone, and the charcoal fraction in terra preta intercepts that movement and holds the nutrients where a plant can reach them. Whoever produced this ground solved the central constraint of Amazonian agriculture, and the solution is still functioning under crops today. How deliberately it was produced is the question the field has argued over ever since Sombrook, and the argument has not fully closed. One position holds that terra preta is a byproduct, the accumulated waste of settlements that stayed in one place for centuries. People burnt fires, threw out fish bones and turtle shell, broke pots, swept ash and food waste, and human and animal excrement into middens, and over generations the ground beneath a village became something entirely different from the ground around it, without anyone intending a soil. The evidence for this is strong. The deposits sit where houses sat. They are full of domestic refuse, and their depth corresponds to how long the occupation lasted. A second position points to a related but distinguishable material. Alongside the black earth, and typically surrounding it in larger continuous expanses, is a lighter brown soil that Brazilian researchers call terra mulata. It is enriched and dark, though less so, and it contains far less pottery and far less domestic debris. That combination is difficult to explain as village refuse, since refuse comes with the broken pots attached. The interpretation many researchers now favour is that terra mulata represents worked fields adjacent to the settlements, ground improved by the repeated addition of charcoal and organic matter through low-temperature burning of vegetation and mulch in place, a practice sometimes described as slash and char, in contrast to slash and burn. Open burning converts most of the biomass to ash and smoke and delivers a pulse of fertility that rain removes within a few seasons. Smouldering the same material under a cover so that it chars rather than combusts, leaves the carbon in the ground where it goes on working. If terra malata was made that way, then at least part of this was a technique rather than an accident, understood and repeated because it produced a result. The consensus among archaeologists working on the problem now tends to accept both processes operating together, with the habitation deposits forming as unintended residue and the field soils involving a degree of management, though no one has been able to demonstrate the intent directly, since intent does not fossilize. Dating the deposits places them in a suggestive window. Radiocarbon results from dark earth sites across the basin cluster, mainly within the last 2,500 years, with the majority of formation falling between roughly the beginning of the Common Era and the arrival of Europeans, and with the deepest and most extensive deposits corresponding to the later part of that range. The pattern indicates something that had been difficult to establish by any other means, which is that populations in the deep basin were becoming larger and more settled during exactly the centuries when Upano was flourishing on the Andean flank and afterward. Work by Eduardo Neves and colleagues at sites near the confluence of the Rio Negro and the Solimões, including Asutuba and Hatahara, has documented occupation sequences running over 1,000 years, with dark earth accumulating throughout, which is not a signature that transient villages leave. How much of the basin carries this soil remains genuinely unresolved. Published estimates have ranged from a fraction of 1% of Amazonia to several percent, and the range is wide because nobody has surveyed systematically across 7 million square kilometres, and because the soil is invisible under forest until something exposes it. Even the low end of that range describes an area larger than many European countries. The high end would describe a region that had been substantially rebuilt by the people living in it. What can be said with more confidence is the direction of the inference. Terra preta appears where people stayed, so its distribution is a rough map of where sedentary populations were, and that map shows dark earth along the main stem, along the lower reaches of the major tributaries, around the confluences, and at points well inland from any river. It does not show a wilderness lightly used. The reversal this forces on the picture from the previous stage of the investigation is close to total. The account of Amazonian limits assumed a fixed environment that human societies had to accommodate themselves to, and concluded that the accommodation permitted only small mobile groups. Terra preta describes the opposite relationship. The environment was not a set of conditions these people lived within. It was a medium they altered, and the alteration outlasted them by 1,000 years, and is still growing food for their descendants, and for strangers. That changes what kind of question to ask about the rest of the basin. If the soil beneath a settlement can be transformed, the settlement itself need not have been small, and the constraint that made large Amazonian societies seem impossible was never as fixed as it looked, which leaves the obvious test. Somewhere out in the lowlands, far from Andean ash, and far from the river Bluffs, there ought to be the remains of places built by people who were not limited in the way the theory required. In the flooded savannas of northern Bolivia, an aircraft carrying the same instrument that stripped the canopy from the Upano Valley has been flying survey lines over ground that floods for half of every year, 900 kilometers southeast of the Upano Valley. On the other side of the Andean spur, the land flattens into something that does not look like Amazonia at all. The Llanos de Mojos occupies a great basin in the Bolivian department of Beni, drained by the Mamaray, the Beni, and the Itenes, all of which eventually feed the Madeira and the Amazon proper. It sits low, around 150 meters above sea level, and it is nearly featureless. For roughly half of each year it is dry savanna, coarse grass under a hard sun, with darker patches of forest standing on the slightly higher ground like islands. For the other half, it is underwater. The rains arrive, the rivers rise past their banks, and sheet flooding spreads across tens of thousands of square kilometres to a depth that can reach a metre or more, standing for months before it drains away. A landscape of that kind imposes a constraint every bit as severe as poor soil, and in some respects a harsher one, because it is not a limit on what will grow, it is a limit on where a person can stand. Anything built on the flat is destroyed or made uninhabitable each wet season, paranut, and any place that is going to be occupied permanently has to be raised above the water first. The earthworks in Mojos were never hidden the way the Yapano platforms were hidden, because there is no closed canopy to hide them. Swedish archaeologist Erland Nordenskjöld excavated mounds here in 1913 and recognized them as artificial. In the 1960s, the American geographer William Dunedin worked through aerial photographs of the Savanna and mapped a landscape covered with human construction, raised agricultural fields in ridged patterns, long straight causeways, crossing the floodplain, canals, and hundreds of habitation mounds, and published the results as a study of the region's aboriginal cultural geography. Clark Erickson spent decades from the 1980s onward investigating how the raised field systems functioned. None of this was secret knowledge. What none of it could establish, from the ground or from a photograph taken looking straight down at flat terrain, was the vertical dimension and the internal organization of the largest sites, because the mounds are covered in dense forest, and the relationships between structures are invisible under it. In 2022, a team led by the German archaeologist Heiko Prumers, working with Carla Jaimes Betancourt, Jose Iriarte, Mark Robinson, and Eduardo Neves, published the results of an airborne laser survey of the Mojos Savanna in the journal Nature. The survey covered 6 blocks totaling around 200 square kilometres and recorded 26 sites, 11 of which had not been documented before. The sites belong to what archaeologists call the Cassara Bay culture, named after a locality in the region, which the evidence places between roughly 500 and 1400 of the Common Era. 2 of the 26 turned out to be considerably larger than anything previously suspected in the Bolivian lowlands. They are called Cotoca and Landivar, and what the laser recorded at Cotoca is a settlement built in tiers. At the centre stands a rectangular platform mound, terraced in stages, carrying a conical pyramid on its summit, with the whole assembly rising to around 22 metres above the surrounding savanna. 22 metres of piled earth in a place with no stone, moved basket by basket in a landscape where the material has to be dug from ground that floods. Around that centre, the survey found U-shaped structures and further platforms arranged on a shared orientation, and around those, 3 concentric rings of banks and ditches enclosing an inner precinct, then an outer zone, then a further perimeter, with the outermost enclosure of the site extending across an area measured in square kilometres rather than hectares. Radiating outward from the enclosures, causeways run across the flood plain in straight lines, some of them for several kilometres, connecting the centre to smaller settlements around it, and running alongside or beside them are canals. The causeway and the canal are the same construction seen twice, since the earth raised to form the raised road is there the earth removed to form the channel, and the pairing gives a route that stays dry in the wet season and a waterway that carries a canoe when the water is high. Reservoirs sit within the enclosures, holding water through the dry half of the year when the savanna hardens and surface water disappears. Taken across the whole survey, The sites fall into a hierarchy of 4 levels by size and complexity, from the 2 primary centres down through secondary sites, with their own platform architecture, to small mounds with none, all of them tied into the causeway network, and the settlement system, as reconstructed, extends across something in the order of 4,500 square kilometres. That is a region roughly the size of a small country, organised around 2 centres, in the middle of what most maps of the pre-Columbian Americas leave blank. The word the authors used in their title was urbanism, qualified by an adjective that carries most of the weight: low density. The qualification is what allows Kotoka to be discussed in the same sentence as a city without the comparison collapsing, and understanding it resolves most of the confusion this discovery produces in people who encounter it. The model of a city that came down to us from Mesopotamia and the Mediterranean is compact and bounded. Uruk enclosed a few hundred hectares within a wall, and put tens of thousands of people inside it, at densities comparable to a modern town, with the fields lying outside the wall and the food carried in. It is a design suited to a place where grain can be stored in bulk and moved efficiently, and where the agricultural land is fertile enough that a small area feeds a large population. Neither of those conditions holds in the wet tropics. Root crops do not store like wheat, yields per hectare are lower, and the land that produces them is scattered rather than concentrated. Under those conditions, the compact design does not work, and societies that developed urban complexity in tropical environments arrived at a different arrangement, in which the population is spread thinly across a very large area. Dwellings are interspersed with the gardens and fields that feed them, and the whole dispersed mass is bound together by monumental centres and by infrastructure that connects them. The archaeologist Roland Fletcher, who developed the concept comparatively, has argued that this is not a failed or incomplete urbanism. It is a distinct settlement form, with its own logic, its own advantages, and its own characteristic vulnerabilities. The clearest example is Angkor, where survey has revealed an agro-urban landscape of canals, reservoirs, roads, and dispersed habitation covering something approaching 1,000 square kilometres around the temple centres, a settlement so extensive that it was not recognised as a single system until the water management network was mapped. Airborne laser survey in the Maya lowlands has produced the same reversal, showing causeways, terraced fields, and continuous low-density occupation between centres that were once thought to stand isolated in the forest with ceremonial functions and little else. Kotoka and Landivar fit that family. They are not scaled-down copies of an old-world city, and they are not villages that happen to have a mound. They are the tropical design, arrived at independently in the Bolivian Savanna by people with no contact whatever with Cambodia or Yucatan, because the same constraints tend to produce the same solutions. Certain features at Kasarabe sites recur with a regularity that indicates shared planning rules rather than local improvisation. The platform complexes hold a consistent orientation from site to site. The concentric enclosures repeat. The causeways depart on comparable bearings. Whoever laid out a new centre was working from an understood template, applied across a region larger than many European states, and maintained across something close to 9 centuries. How many people lived inside that system is a question the researchers have deliberately left open. Estimating population from earthworks requires assumptions about how many structures stood at the same time and how many people occupied each, and Prumers has been publicly cautious about putting a figure on it, saying, "The data do not yet support one. The evidence establishes organization and scale without establishing a head count, and it is more honest to hold those apart. The Kasarabe result also settles the objection that has been outstanding since the first stage of this investigation. Upano could be dismissed as an Andean flank special case with volcanic soil and highland connections. Mojos cannot. It lies in the lowlands, hundreds of kilometres from the mountains, on the seasonally flooded plains of the southwestern Amazon, with no volcano, no stone, no metal, and no imported fertility. The people who built there faced an environment that took their land away for 6 months of every year, and their response was to raise the ground above the flood and connect the raised places with a network engineered to work in both seasons. 2 independent laser surveys in 2 very different parts of the basin have now shown the same thing, which is settlement organized at a regional scale by societies the standard account said could not exist. And the pattern does not stop at 2. Along the Brazilian frontier to the north, where cattle ranching has stripped the forest of tens of thousands of square kilometres since the 1970s, the cleared ground has been exposing something that requires no laser at all to see. The evidence in the Bolivian savanna and the Ecuadorian foothills had to be found with an aircraft carrying a laser. In the Brazilian state of Acre, in the far west of the country near the Peruvian and Bolivian borders, it was uncovered by bulldozers. Beginning in the 1970s, government policy pushed settlement and cattle ranching into the western Amazon, and over the following decades, tens of thousands of square kilometres of forest were felled and burnt to make pasture. What emerged on the cleared ground was geometry, ditched enclosures cut into the earth in precise shapes, squares and circles, and hexagons and composite forms, with one figure set inside another, each one bounded by a trench, with the excavated soil banked along its outer edge. They are large. A typical enclosure measures somewhere between 1 and 300 metres across. The ditches commonly run 1 to 4 metres deep and can reach 11 metres wide, and a single earthwork represents a quantity of soil that a small group could not shift in any reasonable time. A Brazilian paleontologist named Alceu Ranzi saw the first of them from an aeroplane window in 1977 while flying over recently cleared land, recognized the shapes as artificial, and returned to the problem 2 decades later, working with the Brazilian archaeologist Denise Schahn and the Finnish archaeologist Martti Persinen to survey and excavate them systematically. More than 450 have now been recorded across roughly 13,000 square kilometers of eastern Acre and adjacent parts of Bolivia, and the count has continued to rise as clearance continues, which is an uncomfortable relationship between destruction and discovery that the researchers involved have commented on openly. The structures were given the name geoglyphs, which is not an ideal term because it invites comparison with the Nazca lines, and the comparison misleads. The Nazca figures are surface markings made by removing dark stones to expose lighter ground, meant to be seen as images. The Acre earthworks are excavated architecture, ditches and banks that a person walks into and stands inside, and their geometric regularity is a property of the plan rather than a picture drawn for a viewer above. Radiocarbon dates from the ditch fills and associated deposits place most construction and use between roughly 2,000 and 1,000 years ago, with some sites showing earlier activity and others remaining in use later. And the sequence indicates that individual enclosures were built, used, allowed to silt up, and in some cases recut. What they were for is the interesting part, because the excavations produced a negative result that turned out to be informative. Inside the enclosures there is very little, almost no domestic refuse, thin scatters of pottery rather than the dense accumulations of village leaves, no terra preta of any depth, no post patterns indicating substantial permanent housing across most of the interiors. The enclosures were kept clean. Occupation debris tends to appear outside them or nearby rather than within, which points away from these being fortified settlements and toward their functioning as places people gathered periodically for purposes other than living. Schahn and Persinen proposed a ceremonial interpretation on that basis, and archaeologists working elsewhere have noted the structural resemblance to the henge monuments of Neolithic Britain, which are also ditched enclosures with external banks, also largely empty inside, and also built by societies without cities. The resemblance is a matter of parallel solutions to a similar intention rather than any connection between the two, and the point of raising it is that Europe accepted long ago that a ditched enclosure containing nothing can be one of the most important places in a landscape. The question that follows is what kind of forest these were built in, and the answer arrived through a technique that reads plants rather than pots. Many plant species deposit microscopic particles of silica in their tissues, and those particles, called phytoliths, take shapes characteristic of the plant that formed them. They survive in soil after the plant has decayed, so a core taken down through the ground records, layer by layer, which kinds of vegetation stood there across thousands of years. A team led by Jennifer Watling, working with Iriarte, Schahn, Persinen, and others, published such an analysis in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2017, taking cores inside and around the enclosures at Jaco Sa and Fazenda Colorado, and reading the phytolith and charcoal record back through several thousand years. Their results complicated the picture in both directions. The area had been forested throughout, dominated for long periods by bamboo, and the builders had not clear-felled it to make room for their earthworks. What the record showed instead was long-term modification, repeated small-scale burning, temporary openings maintained rather than expanded, and a persistent enrichment of useful species, with palms increasing markedly in the vicinity of the sites. The forest around the geoglyphs was being managed as a resource, thinned and weighted toward plants people wanted, over a period considerably longer than the enclosures themselves were in use. The conclusion Watling and her colleagues drew has a double edge that both sides of the modern argument have quoted at each other. Pre-Columbian Amazonians were not passive occupants of a wilderness, since the vegetation records their intervention over millennia. Neither were they engaged in transformation on the scale that some popular accounts have suggested, since the forest was never removed. The intervention was continuous, cumulative, and comparatively light-handed, and the resulting landscape looked, to anyone arriving later, exactly like untouched forest. That last point is the one worth holding on to. When Acre was mapped in the 20th century, the land covering these earthworks was recorded as primary rainforest, and by any standard botanical assessment, that is what it was. The trees were old, and the canopy was closed. Underneath sat 450 pieces of monumental architecture. 2,000 kilometres to the east, at the opposite end of the basin, where the Amazon meets the Atlantic, a different society had left a different kind of evidence. Marajo is an island, the size of Switzerland, sitting in the river's mouth, low, flat, and flooded across much of its eastern half for half of every year. Rising out of that flooded savanna are artificial mounds, known locally as tessos, hundreds of them, some standing around 10 meters high and covering several hectares at the base. Along the Anajaz River, the Camutins group contains dozens of them clustered together. The culture that built them is called Marajoara, and the evidence places it between roughly 400 and 1300 of the Common Era. The mounds served as raised ground to live on, as platforms for structures, and as cemeteries, and the burials in them produced the material Marajo is known for. Marajoara funerary ceramics are large, polychrome, painted in red and black on white slip, and covered in incised and excised geometric designs, with anthropomorphic urns carrying modelled faces and limbs. They are technically demanding objects, produced by specialists, and they are unlike anything the surrounding regions made. Anna Roosevelt excavated at Teso dos Bicos in the 1980s and found deep occupation layers with hearths and domestic debris accumulated over centuries, indicating that the mounds were lived on continuously rather than visited. And she argued from the faunal remains that the population was sustained principally by fish taken from the seasonal floodwaters, which in that environment renew themselves annually in enormous quantity. Her interpretation placed Marajoara as a locally developed society, drawing on locally available abundance, which cut directly against the reading that had held the field for the previous 30 years, and the collision between those two readings is where this investigation has to go next. Set the three regions beside one another, and the shape of the problem changes. The Upano Valley on the Andean flank, the Casarabe centers in the Bolivian savanna, the Acre enclosures in the western forest, the Marajoara mounds at the river's mouth. 4 regions separated by thousands of kilometres, occupied by peoples with no demonstrated contact between them, working in different centuries, facing different constraints, and arriving at different solutions to the same underlying problem of how to stay in one place in the wet tropics. Nothing about this looks like a single lost civilization, and the popular framing that reaches for one misses what the evidence is actually showing. It shows diversity, which is a far stronger result. A single anomalous site can be explained away as an outlier. A basin containing many unrelated societies, all of them building at scale, all of them modifying the ground and the vegetation they lived among, describes a normal condition rather than an exception, which raises the question that the rest of this investigation has to answer, and it is no longer a question about the Amazon, it is a question about us. All of this material was in the ground the whole time. Some of it was published in the 1960s. Some of it was written down in the 1540s by a man who travelled the length of the river and reported what he saw, and was disbelieved for 400 years. In February of 1542, a Spanish expedition came down out of the Andes, on the wrong side of the mountains, ran out of food, and found itself unable to travel back upstream against the current. Francisco de Orellana had set out from Quito as second in command of a party looking for cinnamon and gold, been sent ahead with a brigantine to find supplies, and discovered that the river he was on would not let him return. What followed was an 8-month drift down the entire length of the Amazon to the Atlantic, and among the 60 or so men aboard was a Dominican friar named Gaspar de Carvajal, who kept an account of it. His narrative is the only written description of the river before European disease had moved through it, and it describes a place that later readers could not reconcile with the Amazon they knew. Carvajal reported settlement that went on and on. In one stretch he wrote of villages following one another along the bank, so closely that the expedition passed inhabited ground for days without a break, and he described a province ruled by a lord named Maquiparo, whose territory extended along the water for a great distance, and another belonging to the Omagua, where the buildings were of better construction and the pottery, he said, was of a quality that would not have shamed a workshop in Malaga. He recorded roads running inland from the river, wide and well kept, disappearing into the interior toward places the Spaniards did not dare walk to. He described fleets of canoes coming out to meet them in numbers that forced the brigantines to keep to the middle of the channel, and stores of food and turtle pens large enough to provision a town. He also described being attacked by women fighting alongside the men, tall and pale-skinned and formidable. And it is from that passage, filtered through the classical education of the men who read it, that the river took the name it now carries. That last detail did a great deal of damage to the rest of the account, because a report containing Amazons reads as a report containing fabrications, and for 400 years Carvajal was treated as a man who had embroidered his hardships. There were reasonable grounds for skepticism beyond the warrior women. He was writing to justify an expedition that had abandoned its commander. He had every incentive to make the country sound worth returning to. He was recording what he saw from a boat under intermittent attack, and he did not go ashore in most of the places he described. Distances and numbers in 16th century Spanish narratives are notoriously elastic, but the core of what he reported was not exotic. It was villages, food, pottery, canoes and roads, and later travellers on the same river found none of it. When the Portuguese moved up the Amazon in force in the following century, the riverbanks were comparatively empty, and by the time naturalists like Bates and Wallace were working there in the 1850s, the population along the main stem was sparse and dispersed, living in exactly the small mobile groups that the environment was later held to require. Two explanations were available. Either Carvajal had lied, or something had happened in the interval. The 19th and 20th centuries chose the first, and the choice hardened into a scientific position rather than remaining a historical judgment. The person who gave that position its most rigorous form was an American archaeologist named Betty Meggers, who worked at the Smithsonian for more than 60 years, and who, with her husband Clifford Evans, excavated on Marajo and in Guyana and Ecuador beginning in the late 1940s. Meggers was a serious field archaeologist, and her argument deserves to be stated as she made it, because it is routinely caricatured now by people who have not read it. She held that the tropical lowland environment, with its leached soils and its absence of storable grain staples, placed a hard ceiling on what human societies there could achieve, and that the archaeological record showed no development past the level of the autonomous village. The elaborate Marajoara ceramics presented an obvious difficulty for that argument, and she resolved it by proposing that the culture had not developed on Marajo at all. Her interpretation had it arriving from the Andean region already formed, then declining under environmental pressure once cut off from its highland source, with the sophistication of the pottery decreasing over the sequence as the society simplified. She set this out at book length in 1971 under the title Amazonia, Man and Culture in a Counterfeit Paradise, and the phrase in the subtitle carried the whole thesis. The forest looks abundant. It is not. Its wealth is a deception that has fooled observers repeatedly, and any apparent evidence of complexity in it should be treated as either imported or misread. The argument was internally consistent. It was built on excavated material and on the soil science of the day, and it explained the discrepancy between Carvajal and every subsequent traveller with great economy. It also arrived at a moment when cultural ecology was ascendant, and explanations grounded in environmental limits carried particular authority. For roughly 30 years it was the framework within which Amazonian archaeology was conducted, and its influence extended well past the discipline, into development policy, and into general accounts of the human past. The dismantling of it took decades and turned bitter. Anna Roosevelt, who had trained in the same tradition and who went to Marajo in the 1980s to test the sequence directly, found at Teso dos Bichos a mound with occupation layers 1.5 meters thick, hearths, storage vessels, and domestic refuse accumulated across centuries, indicating a settled population living on the mound continuously rather than a declining remnant, and her reading of the ceramic sequence found the elaboration increasing over time in place rather than degrading from an imported peak. She went further up the river and produced two results that struck at the foundations rather than the details. At a shell mound called Taparinia near Santarém, she excavated pottery that radiocarbon placed at roughly 7,000 to 8,000 years old, which made it among the oldest ceramics known anywhere in the Americas, and demonstrated that the technology had appeared in the lowland tropics early, rather than arriving late from somewhere more advanced. And at the Caverna de Pedra Pintada, a painted rock shelter near Monte Alegre, she excavated a stratified Paleo-Indian deposit with stone tools, plant remains and hearths dating to around 11,000 years, showing that people had been living in the Amazon at the same period as the Clovis hunters of North America, adapted to forest and river rather than to big game on open plains. Published in Science in 1991 and 1996, those results removed the premise that the basin was a marginal zone, colonized late by peoples whose achievements must have originated elsewhere. The exchange between Roosevelt and Meggers that followed was conducted in print with an unusual degree of personal edge, and it went on for years. Meggers disputed the stratigraphy, questioned whether the dated material was securely associated with the artifacts, and maintained her position substantially unchanged until her death in 2012. She also raised an objection that had nothing to do with soils, and that has aged better than the rest of her argument, warning that inflated claims about pre-Columbian Amazonian populations could be used to justify clearing forest on the grounds that it had all been farmland once. That concern was not baseless, and the more extravagant popular versions of this material have proved her partly right. What settled the substance of the debate was accumulation from outside it. Denevan's mapping in the Bolivian Savanna, Sombrook's dark earths taken up by soil scientists who found what charcoal does, Neves and colleagues documenting millennium-long occupations at the confluence near Manaus, Heckenberger's work in the Xingu, Shan and Persinen in Acre, and eventually the laser surveys. No single result overturned the counterfeit paradise. The weight of independent lines of evidence from unconnected regions did. In 1992, the geographer William Denevan gave the underlying assumption a name in a paper called The Pristine Myth, arguing that the Americas encountered by Europeans were not a natural landscape lightly occupied, that the apparent wilderness of the 17th and 18th centuries was itself a historical artifact produced by the collapse of the populations that had been managing it, and that the wilderness later generations set out to preserve was in significant part a ruin they had mistaken for an original condition. That reframing is what makes Carvajal readable again. He is not a reliable witness in detail, and no serious researcher treats him as one. The turtle pens and the roads and the endless riverside villages are no longer impossible, though, and they sit alongside dark earth deposits on exactly the bluffs he was describing, formed by exactly the sort of long-term dense occupation he reported, which leaves the 4 centuries of disbelief needing an explanation of their own. And the explanation is not that anyone was concealing evidence. Almost everything discussed so far was accessible. The mounds on Marajo were excavated in the 1870s. Nordenskiold published the Bolivian earthworks in 1913, and even mapped the causeways from photographs available to anyone. Sombrook described the black earths in 1966. The Acre enclosures sat under forest that was standing and could have been surveyed. What was missing was not data. It was the expectation that would have made the data mean something, and in its absence the evidence was filed as anomalous, local, intrusive, or exaggerated, one item at a time, for a very long while. The gap this investigation began with was never entirely in the ground. In the northeastern corner of the Bolivian Beni, near the small town of Bores, the Savanna carries a pattern that took a long time to be read correctly. Low earthen walls, no more than knee-height and around a metre wide, run across the seasonally flooded plain in long zigzag lines, kilometre after kilometre, with the angles turning back on themselves at regular intervals. Where the walls meet, and at points along them, there are small ponds, roughly circular, a few tens of metres across, each connected to the wall system by short channels. The whole arrangement covers something in the order of 500 square kilometres, and it is not agricultural. Clark Erickson, working in the region from the 1990s, interpreted these structures as fish weirs, and the interpretation follows from how the landscape behaves. For half the year, this plain is underwater, and fish move freely across it in enormous numbers, spreading out from the rivers and channels into the flooded grassland to feed and spawn. Then the rains stop, and the water begins to withdraw. In an unmodified floodplain, the fish withdraw with it, back into the permanent channels, and the annual abundance simply leaves. The zigzag walls interrupt that retreat. Water draining off the plain is funneled along the angles, and the fish moving with it are guided toward the openings in the walls, where they can be taken in quantity, or into the ponds, where they remain alive and available through the dry season. Gaps in the walls at intervals appear to be deliberate, positioned where a trap or a basket could be set. The ponds hold water when everything around them has hardened, and some of them show evidence of having been deepened and maintained. What this describes is not fishing as an activity, but fishing as an installation built into the landscape and operating on the annual cycle without daily labor. The rain does the work of gathering. The structures do the work of holding. A person arrives at the right season and harvests a resource that has been concentrated for them by a system their grandparents built, and the protein problem that was supposed to cap Amazonian populations is answered not by finding more animals, but by redesigning the plain so that the animals cannot leave. Erickson has argued that the fisheries could have supported substantial populations, though the estimates involved rest on assumptions about yields and about how much of the system operated simultaneously, and the dating of the earthworks is less secure than the dating of habitation mounds because the walls contain little datable material. The same region carries a second and better studied system for producing food, and it addresses the other half of the problem. Across the Llanos de Mojos, aerial photographs and ground survey have recorded raised fields, long, low platforms of soil built up above the surrounding surface, with drainage channels between them, laid out in blocks that in some areas run to many thousands of hectares in total. Denovan mapped them in the 1960s. Erickson spent years on how they worked. The principle is straightforward, and it solves several problems at once. In a landscape that floods for half the year and bakes hard for the other half, a raised planting surface stays above standing water in the wet season and retains moisture in the dry, while the ditches between the platforms hold water, accumulate organic sediment, and can be dredged so that the muck is thrown back onto the growing surface as fertilizer. That dredging is the part that matters most for the nutrient argument, because it means the system regenerates its own fertility on a cycle rather than exhausting it. Aquatic plants, algae and silt build up in the channels continuously, and returning them to the beds replaces what the crops take out. Ericsson tested this rather than assuming it. Beginning in the 1990s, he worked with communities in the Beni to rebuild sections of raised field using hand tools, planting maize and manioc on the reconstructed platforms and recording what happened across several seasons. The experimental fields produced well, and the exercise established that the system could be built and maintained with the technology available, using labor that a community rather than a state could organize. The archaeology in the region also records causeways and canals running between the field blocks and the settlement mounds, so the fields, the fisheries, the transport network and the habitation sites form a single connected infrastructure rather than separate categories of evidence. Similar raised field systems exist elsewhere in tropical America, in coastal Ecuador, in the Guianas, in the San Jorge Basin of Colombia, and around Lake Titicaca, which indicates the solution was arrived at repeatedly wherever seasonal flooding and permanent settlement met. A third element in Mojos was noticed only recently, and it changed how far back this goes. Scattered across the savanna are thousands of small patches of forest, standing a meter or two above the grassland, locally called islas, or forest islands, and for a long time they were assumed to be a natural feature of the drainage. Survey work has since shown that a large proportion of them are anthropogenic, built up from the debris of human occupation in the same way the dark earths of the central Amazon were. And a study led by Umberto Lombardo, published in Nature in 2020, reported excavations at a number of these mounds with phytolith evidence for manioc, squash, and maize. The dates ran back much further than expected, with cultivation of manioc and squash indicated from around 10,000 and 10,200 years ago respectively, and maize appearing later. That places southwestern Amazonia among the early centers of plant domestication worldwide, alongside the Fertile Crescent, China, and Mesoamerica, and it means the relationship between people and this landscape had been developing for something close to 10 millennia before the Kasarabe centers were built. The infrastructure that appears at Kotoka did not come from nowhere. It sits at the end of a very long process of accumulated knowledge about what this plain can be made to do. Across the basin as a whole, the food systems that supported settled populations were mixed rather than dependent on a single staple. And this is a point that the older debate about protein ceilings tended to obscure by looking for an equivalent to wheat or rice. Manioc supplied bulk calories from poor soil. Maize was grown where conditions allowed and is attested at Kasarabe sites and in Mojos generally. Fish supplied protein at a scale that dwarfs terrestrial game in floodplain environments, supplemented by turtles, which Carvajal reported being kept in pens and which store as living food for months. Palms supplied fruit, oil, starch, and construction material, and the enrichment of palms around archaeological sites, recorded by Watling in Acre, appears across the basin. Tree crops, including Brazil nut and cacao, contributed, and the fields and the managed forest were not separate zones, but interleaved, with gardens grading into orchard, into worked forest without a hard boundary. That mixture is more resilient than a monoculture, since a failure in one component does not empty the stores, and it is also much harder for archaeologists to see because it leaves no granaries and no obvious field boundaries in most places. The absence of a visible staple economy was read for decades as the absence of an economy capable of supporting anything. What the Bolivian evidence shows is a food system engineered at the scale of the landscape rather than the plot, which is a different design and not a lesser one. The scale of that engineering leads to a conclusion that is easy to state and takes a while to absorb. These societies did not adapt to the Amazon in the sense of fitting themselves into what was already there. They rebuilt the surface they lived on. They raised planting beds above the flood, dug channels to move water and canoes, walled the plain to trap fish, mounded up ground to live on, made soil where soil would not otherwise hold nutrients, and weighted the forest toward the species they used. The result was a productive landscape, and like any productive landscape, it required maintenance, which means it depended on the continued existence of the people who knew how to maintain it. A raised field abandoned for a decade is a low mound in the grass. A fish weir that no one repairs is a line of earth that the water goes around. When the population that operated all this was gone, the machinery did not stop being present. It stopped being legible, and what remained looked like nature, which brings this investigation to the part that has been waiting since the beginning, because everything described so far was working, and then within a century or so of a particular date, almost none of it was. There is a way of testing all of this that does not involve digging anything up, and it rests on a fact about trees that is easy to overlook. A tree standing in the Amazon today may have been alive for 2 or 3 centuries, but the population it belongs to has been reproducing in that spot for far longer, and the composition of a forest is a record of what has been favoured there over long periods. If people spent thousands of years planting, protecting, transplanting, and clearing around particular species, that preference ought to still be visible in what grows now. In 2017, a team led by the Brazilian ecologist Carolina Levis, working with Flavia Costa, Hans Testige, Charles Clement, and a large group of collaborators, tested exactly that. They used the Amazon Tree Diversity Network, a compilation of more than 1,100 forest survey plots distributed across the basin in which every tree above a minimum diameter had been identified and counted, and set it against a database of more than 3,000 known archaeological sites. Of the roughly 16,000 tree species estimated to occur in Amazonia, they identified 85 that are known to have been domesticated or brought under some degree of human management before European contact, including Brazil nut, cacao, acai, peach, palm, rubber, and caimito. The question was whether those 85 behaved differently from the other 15,900. They did. Domesticated species were found to be 5 times more likely than non-domesticated ones to be hyperdominant, meaning present in unusually high abundance across many plots, and their concentration increased measurably in the vicinity of archaeological sites, with the effect strongest in the southwestern and eastern parts of the basin, where pre-Columbian occupation is most densely recorded. The paper appeared in Science, and its conclusion was that the modern composition of Amazonian forests carries a legacy of pre-Columbian plant domestication that is still detectable across large distances. The result requires care in how it is stated, and the authors were careful. It does not establish that people planted every stand of Brazil nut where one now grows, and other explanations have been proposed for parts of the pattern, including that people chose to settle where useful species already grew rather than the other way around, which would produce a similar correlation from the opposite direction. Subsequent work, including analyses led by Crystal McMichael, has argued that the effect is concentrated near rivers and known settlement zones rather than distributed evenly, and that large areas of interfluvial forest show little sign of it. The honest summary is that the correlation is real and strong in some regions, that causation is difficult to isolate, and that the disagreement is now about how much of the basin was affected rather than about whether the effect exists. What is not in dispute is the direction of the finding. A forest that was thought to be the baseline against which human impact is measured turns out to be, in places, partly a consequence of human impact. Brazil nut makes the point better than any statistic. The tree grows to 50 meters, lives for centuries, and produces its seeds inside a woody capsule so hard that almost nothing can open it. One animal can. The agouti, a large rodent, gnaws through the shell, eats some of the seeds, and buries the rest in caches it does not always return to, and those buried seeds are how the species reproduces. Brazil nut trees also grow characteristically in dense stands, called castanheirs, rather than scattered singly through the forest, as most Amazonian trees do, and those stands occur disproportionately on and near archaeological sites and dark earth deposits. Researchers have proposed that the distribution reflects long-term human involvement, with people transporting and discarding seeds, protecting seedlings and clearing competitors around productive trees over many generations. A forest ecologist looking at a castanhal is looking at something that took centuries of intermittent tending to produce, and that no living person planted. The most direct evidence about how such landscapes were organized comes from a region where the descendants of the builders are still present. The Upper Xingu, in the Brazilian state of Mato Grosso, is the headwater basin of a major southern tributary, and it is home to the Guicuro and other peoples of the Xinguano complex, who speak several unrelated languages but share a common cultural and ritual system. In 1993, the American archaeologist Michael Heckenberger began working there with the Guicuro, and the collaboration has continued for decades, with Guicuro leaders including Afukaka Guicuro as active participants in the research rather than informants to it. The archaeology they documented is substantial. Between roughly 1200 and 1600 of the Common Era, the Upper Xingu contained a network of settlements in a pattern the researchers described as clustered and hierarchical. Larger plaza towns, some enclosing an area of several dozen hectares, were surrounded by ditches up to 2.5 meters deep with palisade banks, and around each of these sat smaller satellite villages at fairly regular distances. The settlements are connected by roads, and the roads are the striking part. They run straight between the plazas of connected settlements. They are bordered by earthen curbs. The major ones reach widths of up to 50 meters, and they meet the plazas on consistent orientations, so that the network has an angular geometry maintained across the whole cluster. Between the settlements lie the remains of managed ground, including manioc gardens, wetland fish ponds, and areas of orchard forest. Kuhikugu, at the headwaters of the Xingu, is one of the largest of these sites. The Xinguano case matters for a reason beyond its scale. The villages the Guicuro live in today are laid out on the same plan as the archaeological plazas, circular, with houses arranged around an open central space containing a men's house, oriented in the same way, connected to neighbouring villages by roads maintained in the same fashion. The continuity is direct and observable, which means the interpretation of the archaeological sites does not depend entirely on inference from the ground, and it also means the epidemic history is documented rather than reconstructed. Xinguano populations fell drastically after European contact reached the region indirectly through disease, and again in the 20th century, and the peoples of the Upper Xingu today occupy a fraction of the territory their ancestors organized and number in the low thousands. Heckenberger has described the modern villages as the surviving pieces of a system that once operated at a far larger scale. This is where the popular framing of this whole subject breaks down, and it is worth naming plainly. The material discussed across this investigation is routinely described as a lost civilization, and both words are wrong. There was no single civilization. There were many societies across the basin, unrelated to one another, speaking languages from different families, building in different ways for different reasons across a span of thousands of years, and nothing about it is lost in the sense the phrase implies. The Kwikoro are in the upper Xingu. Descendant peoples live throughout the basin, in many cases on or near the sites their ancestors built, and in many cases they have been telling researchers about them for a long time. The dark earths were named by the people who farm them. The Kastanhais are managed today by communities who gather from them. The forest islands of Mojos and the mounds of Marajo sit in landscapes that were never emptied of people, only massively depopulated, which is a different thing. Treating this as a mystery about a vanished race obscures the actual finding, which is that the Amazon is a cultural landscape with living heirs, and that the people best placed to explain parts of it have not gone anywhere. That framing also changes what the forest itself is. If the composition of the vegetation in significant areas reflects millennia of human management, then the distinction between natural and cultural landscape does not hold cleanly here, and the conservation questions that follow are genuinely difficult, since preserving a managed landscape by excluding management is not obviously preservation. Researchers have made that argument in both directions, and it is not resolved. What can be said is that the forest standing over the geoglyphs of Acre and the platforms of Upano is not a witness to human absence. It is closer to a residue of human presence, grown up over a system that stopped being maintained. Which returns to the question that has been deferred twice now, because a system that requires maintenance and then does not receive it implies that something removed the people who were maintaining it. The evidence for what that was is unusually clear, and its timing can be read not only in the archaeology of the basin, but, according to one line of research, in the composition of the atmosphere itself. The collapse of Amazonian societies after European contact has a peculiar quality that makes it harder to study than almost any comparable event, which is that most of it happened when nobody was watching. Disease moved faster than the people who carried it. Smallpox, measles, influenza, and later diseases entered populations that had no prior exposure and therefore no acquired immunity, and they moved along the same routes that carried everything else, which in this basin means the rivers and the trade networks that connected settlements across enormous distances. A pathogen introduced at the mouth of the Amazon does not need Europeans to travel upstream. It needs canoes, and there were a great many canoes. Carvajal came down the river in 1542 and described continuous riverside settlement. The Portuguese moved upriver in force in the 1630s and 1640s and found something substantially reduced. In the interval, almost nothing was recorded because there was almost no one there to record it, and what happened in the interior away from the main stem is not documented at all. Estimates of the scale involved vary widely and should be quoted with that variation attached. Figures proposed for the pre-contact population of the Americas as a whole have ranged from roughly 40 million to over 100 million, with the commonly cited mid-range estimates falling around 50 to 60 million, and proposed mortality rates over the following century and a half generally running between 80 and 95%. For Amazonia specifically, the estimates are looser still because they depend on inferences from site density, dark earth distribution, and carrying capacity rather than on any documentary record. Dunedin's estimate for Greater Amazonia has been cited at around 5 to 6 million, and other researchers have proposed both higher and lower figures. Nobody has been able to establish a firm number, and the honest position is that the order of magnitude is defensible while the precision is not. What can be said with more confidence is the mechanism, because it has been observed in better documented cases elsewhere. A dense population connected by trade routes transmits an epidemic efficiently. Successive waves arriving every few years prevent recovery between them, since each wave takes the people who would have replaced the previous losses. Mortality falls hardest on adults of working age, which removes both the labor and the knowledge required to keep complex systems running. Agricultural infrastructure that needs annual maintenance fails within a few seasons of neglect. Survivors of a collapsed settlement do not rebuild it at reduced scale. They typically join other groups, move to defensible ground, or shift to a more mobile way of living that requires fewer people to sustain, and that shift is itself a rational adaptation rather than a decline. Slave raiding and forced relocation by Portuguese and Spanish expeditions compounded the demographic damage through the 17th and 18th centuries, concentrating survivors in mission settlements, where further epidemics reached them efficiently. The riverbank societies were hit hardest and first, since they sat on the transmission network, which is precisely why the Várzea, the most productive land in the basin, was among the emptiest ground by the time European naturalists arrived to describe what they took to be its natural condition. What happens next is a matter of materials, and it explains why this collapse left so little that later observers could see. The great majority of what these societies built was made of earth and wood. Earth mounds survive, because a mound is a large mass, and a large mass takes a very long time to disappear, but they lose their edges. Rain in this climate rounds a bank, silts a ditch, and slumps a terrace within centuries, and forest growing on the surface accelerates the process as roots break up the structure. Wood does not survive at all. Houses, palisades, canoes, granaries, weirs, the entire built fabric above ground level decayed within decades in warm, wet conditions with fungi and termites working continuously. Textiles, basketry, featherwork, and everything else made from organic material went with them. What remains in most of Amazonia is pottery, stone tools, altered soil, and modified topography, which is a thin residue from which to reconstruct a society. And it is thin in a way that is systematically misleading, because it removes exactly the categories of evidence that display skill and complexity. A civilization built in stone leaves ruins. A civilization built in earth and wood leaves a landscape that reads as terrain. The exception proves the point neatly. On the Calçoene River in the Brazilian state of Amapá, near the border with French Guiana, stands a site called Rego Grande, where more than 100 granite blocks, some of them 3 meters tall, were set upright in the ground, in a roughly circular arrangement around 30 meters across. The stones lean inward at consistent angles. Several were placed in prepared sockets, and burial urns have been recovered from pits associated with the site, along with ceramics that place the construction in the range of roughly 1,000 years ago. Researchers including Mariana Cabral and João Saldanha have investigated the site and reported alignments that may relate to the position of the sun at the solstice, though the astronomical interpretation remains debated, and the excavators themselves have been cautious about how far it can be pushed. What is not debated is that Rego Grande is visible, that it was noticed, that it acquired a nickname in the press, and that it is discussed as evidence of Amazonian complexity in a way that 450 ditched enclosures in Acre were not for decades. The difference is the material. Granite stands up, earth lies down, and grows trees. There is a further line of evidence about the scale of the depopulation, and it needs to be presented carefully because it is genuinely contested. Ice cores from Antarctica record a decline in atmospheric carbon dioxide during the late 16th and early 17th centuries, with a minimum around 1610, a dip of roughly 7 to 10 parts per million. In 2015, the geographers Simon Lewis and Mark Maslin proposed in Nature that this dip was partly caused by the American depopulation, arguing that the abandonment of tens of millions of hectares of managed and cultivated land allowed forest to regrow across it, and that the regrowing vegetation drew enough carbon out of the atmosphere to register globally. They suggested the year 1610 as a candidate marker for the start of the Anthropocene on that basis, which they named the Orbis hypothesis. The proposal received a great deal of attention and a great deal of criticism. Other researchers have argued that the timing and magnitude are better explained by volcanic activity, by ocean circulation changes, or by the cooling of the Little Ice Age reducing respiration from soils, and that the carbon uptake from American reforestation, while real, was insufficient on its own to produce the observed dip. Modelling studies have come down on both sides. The current position is that the depopulation almost certainly contributed something to the carbon record, and that the claim it was the primary cause is not established. It belongs in this account as a striking and unresolved possibility rather than as a demonstrated fact, and the reason for including it at all is what it would mean if correct, which is that the human population of one hemisphere was large enough that its removal was detectable in the composition of the planet's air. Forest returned to the abandoned ground. How fast is a question with a partial answer, since secondary growth in the tropics closes a canopy within a few decades and begins approaching the structure of mature forest across a century or two, though full recovery of species composition takes far longer, and in some cases never fully occurs, which is part of why the domesticated species signal discussed earlier is still legible today. By the time systematic European exploration of the interior was underway in the 18th and 19th centuries, the forest standing over the abandoned earthworks was mature, closed, and to all appearances ancient. Bates and Wallace, working in the 1850s, were competent and observant naturalists who described what was in front of them accurately. What was in front of them was a landscape roughly 2 centuries into recovery from a demographic catastrophe that no European had witnessed and that no written source described, occupied by dispersed populations who were themselves the survivors of it. Their Amazon was not the original condition of the place. It was a post-collapse condition that had had time to look permanent, and the theory of Amazonian limits that emerged in the following century was built, without anyone intending it, on the observation of a ruin. This is the most important correction the evidence makes, and it is worth stating without dramatization. The forest was not always like this. Neither was it a garden, and the more extravagant versions of that claim go well past what the evidence supports. It was a landscape in which large numbers of people had been living for thousands of years, altering some parts intensively, and other parts lightly, and many parts not at all. And that population was removed within a few generations by pathogens they had no defense against. The trees grew back over the infrastructure. The remaining people were pushed to the margins of the systems their ancestors had built. And the emptiness that later observers took for a natural state and then built a scientific theory upon was among the youngest features in the entire landscape, which leaves the question of how much of this is actually known, and the answer is less flattering than the discoveries themselves suggest, because the surveys that produce them have covered a fraction of the basin so small that it is difficult to state without sounding as though the figure has been exaggerated for effect. The Amazon basin covers somewhere in the region of 6 to 7 million square kilometres, depending on where the boundary is drawn, and the forest itself amounts to roughly 5.5 million. Against that, the areas that have been surveyed with airborne laser can be listed in a sentence. Around 300 square kilometres in the Upano Valley, around 200 in the Bolivian Savanna, blocks of a few dozen or a few hundred square kilometres in the upper Xingu, in parts of Acre, along stretches of the lower Amazon and the Tapajos, and in scattered survey areas flown for forestry and carbon research that archaeologists have since gone back to and re-examined. Add every one of them together, and the total covered by dedicated archaeological survey remains a fraction of 1% of the basin. A study published in Science in 2023 by a team including Vinicius Peripato, Carolina Levis, and Luis Aragão took a different route to the same problem. Rather than commissioning new flights, they went to existing laser data collected across Amazonia for forest monitoring and carbon accounting, a patchwork of survey strips flown for reasons having nothing to do with archaeology, amounting to something in the order of 0.1% of the basin's area. Examining it, they identified 24 previously unrecorded pre-Columbian earthworks, including ditched enclosures, mounds, and fortified sites. They then built a predictive model using the environmental and geographic characteristics of known sites to estimate where others were likely to be, and their published projection put the number of earthworks still undiscovered across Amazonia somewhere between roughly 10,000 and 24,000. That figure is a model output, and the authors presented it as such, with the uncertainty stated plainly. It rests on assumptions about how representative the surveyed strips are, and the surveyed strips were not chosen randomly with respect to human settlement, since forestry flights favour accessible areas near rivers and roads, which are also where people historically lived. The estimate may be too high for exactly that reason, or too low, since the model can only predict sites resembling the ones already known and would not anticipate a category nobody has yet found. What it establishes is not a count, but a proportion. On the evidence available, the great majority of what is in the ground has not been located, and the discoveries of the past 15 years, which have already required the field to reconsider its basic assumptions, were produced by examining a sliver. This is where the strongest counterargument to the whole revision belongs, and it deserves to be given properly rather than acknowledged in passing. Crystal McMichael, working with Mark Bush and others, has spent years arguing that the picture emerging from the archaeological survey is systematically skewed by where archaeologists look. Their work has taken soil cores from interfluvial areas, the vast tracts of terra firma lying between the major rivers, and analysed them for charcoal, phytoliths, and other indicators of human disturbance. Across substantial parts of the western and central basin, the cores show little sign of sustained pre-Columbian occupation. Their argument is that human impact in Amazonia was concentrated along the rivers and the bluffs above them, in a network of corridors that may represent a modest percentage of the total area, and that extrapolating from the density of sites in those corridors to the basin as a whole produces a picture of a heavily managed continent that the interfluvial evidence does not support. They have also pointed out that the strongest correlations between forest composition and archaeology occur near rivers, which is where survey plots also cluster, so the two datasets may be sampling the same accessible strip and finding each other in it. The disagreement between this position and the more expansive readings is real, active, and has been conducted in the same journals over the same decade. It is not a fringe objection, and it is worth noticing that it does not restore anything resembling the counterfeit paradise, since nobody in the current debate disputes that Kasarabe existed, or that the Acre enclosures are there, or that the dark earths were made by people. The argument is now about extent, and an argument about extent is conducted on ground that was won some time ago. The honest summary of the present state of knowledge has three parts. Large, organized, long-lived societies existed in multiple regions of Amazonia, and that is established beyond serious dispute. Those societies modified their environment substantially, and in some regions the modification is still detectable in the soil and in the trees. Whether the pattern extended across most of the basin or was concentrated in a fraction of it is unresolved, and the people best qualified to answer it disagree. That third item is not a weakness in the account. It is the condition of a field that is still finding things faster than it can integrate them. The mechanism now revealing the sites is also destroying them, and this is the part of the story that has no comfortable ending. The Acre earthworks became visible because the forest above them was cleared for cattle, and clearance does not stop at exposure. Ploughing, road cutting, mechanized soil preparation and construction damage, or remove earthworks continuously, and the archaeologists who documented the Acre enclosures have described working in a race against the machinery that uncovered them. Dark earth is stripped and sold as garden soil in parts of Brazil, which removes a stratified archaeological deposit and its contents together. Reservoir flooding behind hydroelectric dams on the Madeira and the Xingu has inundated sites during construction, with salvage archaeology conducted under schedules set by engineering timetables. Mining, both legal and illegal, cuts into the same river terraces where settlement concentrated. Deforestation across the Brazilian Amazon has removed something in the order of a fifth of the original forest area since the 1970s, and each hectare of that involved ground nobody surveyed first. The instrument is the same in both directions, which gives the situation a symmetry that is difficult to look at straight. Removing the forest is how these places are found. Removing the forest is how they are lost. Set against that, the laser survey offers something the bulldozer does not, which is the ability to see without destroying, and the limiting factors are money and flying hours rather than any technical barrier. Newer approaches are being tested, including satellite-based detection and machine learning models trained on known earthwork signatures to search existing imagery automatically, which may extend coverage considerably. None of it removes the need for excavation, since a shape recorded from the air tells you nothing about who built it, when, or why, and every date in this account came from someone digging a hole. What remains, at the end of all this, is a question with a partial answer and a large unfinished portion. Who built the cities under the trees? Part of it can now be answered with specifics. Ancestors of the Quicuro and the other Xinguano peoples built the plaza towns and the curbed roads of the Upper Xingu. The people archaeologists call the Kasarabe built Kotoka and Landivar and the causeways of the Mojos Plain. Communities in Acre dug the enclosures. Communities on Marajó raised the tessos and fired the funerary urns, and somebody in the Upano Valley raised 6,000 platforms and cut roads through the terraces to connect them, and left no name that anyone has recovered. They were not a single civilization, and they were not lost. They were many peoples, over thousands of years, who lived in a place that was later described as empty by observers arriving after a catastrophe, and whose descendants are still there. The rest of the answer is under the canopy. Somewhere between 10 and 24,000 structures, on one estimate, in ground that has never been surveyed, in a forest large enough that a settlement covering several square kilometres can sit beneath it entirely unnoticed for 400 years while people walk across the top of it. There is a habit of mind this whole episode should make a little harder to keep, and it has application well beyond archaeology. For a long time, an absence of evidence in the Amazon was read as evidence of absence, and a theory was constructed on that reading, defended with genuine rigour by serious people and taught for 3 decades. What was actually being observed was the limit of where anyone had looked. That limit has moved a fraction of a percent in the last 15 years, and everything now understood about the human history of this continent's interior came out of that fraction. Tonight the forest sits over the rest of it, 5 million square kilometres of closed canopy, holding whatever it holds. And the honest thing to say about what is down there is that nobody knows, because nobody has yet been able to look.